Thank you very much. My fellow Americans, good evening. It's been just 1 month since the United States military began Operation Epic Fury, targeting the world's #1 state sponsor of terror, Iran. Tonight, Iran's Navy is gone. Their Air Force is in ruins. Their leaders, most of them terrorist regime they led, are now dead. Their command and control of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is being decimated as we speak. Their ability to launch missiles and drones is dramatically curtailed, and their weapons, factories, and rocket launchers are being blown to pieces. Our armed forces have been extraordinary. There's never been anything like it militarily. Everyone is talking about it, and tonight I'm pleased to say that these core strategic objectives are nearing completion. As we celebrate this progress, we think especially of the 13 American warriors who have laid down their lives in this fight to prevent our children from ever having to face a nuclear Iran. Twice this past month, I have traveled to Dover Air Force Base, and it's been something. I wanted to be with those heroes as they return to American soil, and I was with them and their families, their parents, their wives, their husbands. We salute them, and now we must honor them by completing the mission for which they gave their lives. And every single one of the people, their loved ones said, "Please, sir, please finish the job," every one of them. And we are going to finish the job, and we're going to finish it very fast. They have no anti-aircraft equipment. Their radar is 100% annihilated. We are unstoppable as a military force. The nuclear sites that we obliterated with the B-2 bombers have been hit so hard that it would take months to get near the nuclear dust, and we have it under intense satellite surveillance and control. If we see them make a move, even a move for it, we'll hit them with missiles very hard again. We have all the cards, they have none. It's very important that we keep this conflict in perspective. American involvement in World War I lasted 1 year, 7 months, and 5 days. World War II lasted for 3 years, 8 months, and 25 days. The Korean War lasted for 3 years, 1 month, and 2 days. The Vietnam War lasted for 19 years, 5 months, and 29 days. Iraq went on for 8 years, 8 months, and 28 days. We are in this military operation so powerful, so brilliant, against one of the most powerful countries for 32 days. And the country has been eviscerated and essentially is really no longer a threat. They were the bully of the Middle East, but they're the bully no longer. This is a true investment in your children and your grandchildren's future. The whole world is watching, and they can't leave the power, strength, and brilliance. They just can't believe what they're seeing. They leave it to your imagination, but they can't believe what they're seeing, the brilliance of the United States military. Tonight, every American can look forward to a day when we are finally free from the wickedness of Iranian aggression and the specter of nuclear blackmail. Because of the actions we have taken, we are on the cusp of ending Iran's sinister threat to America and the world. And I'll tell you, the world is watching. And when we do, when it's all over, the United States will be safer, stronger, more prosperous, and greater than it has ever been before. May God bless the men and women of the United States Armed Forces, and may God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much, and good night.
After a month of bombing one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, after gas is $4 a gallon, after they quietly have staged thousands of Marines in the region, nobody in corporate media has asked why. Trump gets on national television, and his big gift to the American people is 13 soldiers died. Iran is decimated, and we'll be out in 2 to 3 weeks. Trust me. And the NATO thing, he was absolutely going to do it. He told Reuters this afternoon that he was absolutely considered pulling out. The Telegraph was running with it. European defense ministers were panicking. And then he gets in front of the camera and just doesn't do it. Floats it, implies it, and then puts it back in his pocket, which is classic Trump. The threat is the weapon, right? And he spent it pretty much for nothing. What actually does matter, he said, regime change is not the goal, which is a direct quote. So, what was the goal? Obliterate the missiles, sink the Navy, make sure that they can never build a nuke again. That's it. A month of war, almost 2,000 Iranians dead by the US's own count, probably way more by the official counts. And the stated objective was never to change who runs the country, just to kneecap them, defang them, make them manageable for Israel, essentially. And now the Strait of Hormuz is apparently Europe's problem. The U.S. doesn't need the oil. They're energy independent. We're just here to help. We did the hard part. Now it's up to you. Out of the goodness of our hearts, gas continues to go up. And then what happened in real time, while he was talking, oil dipped slightly below $100 a barrel during the speech. Markets briefly started buying the exit story. And then the second that he finished, oil spiked over 3%. So the markets heard the same speech that you did and said, we don't believe this either. No ceasefire, no real exit plan. Troops are still being staged across the region, and you're seeing deployments throughout the US that are not being reported. The Strait of Hormuz still closed. Brent crude up 27% since this war started in February 28th, sitting just over $100 a barrel, with analysts now saying the global supply system has gone from buffered to fragile. So one more shock and there's nothing left to absorb. But the thing that nobody's saying out loud here is that there's thousands of troops on the ground in the region. Like I said, special operations, Marines, Army paratroopers, staged, ready to go. For what exactly? Because he just said that they were hoping, he said a lot of things because he also said that they were going to finish the job, but didn't really make it clear what the exit plan is. You don't pre-position that kind of force to just leave it. It's, again, it's one of those things in military where it's use it or lose it, and you pre-position those resources to use them, and whether that's on Karg Island, I maybe possibly the uranium stockpiles. They might have actually ruled out Karg Island because of, like, saying we don't need the oil. There is also a chance of them doing their own type of naval blockade where they just do their own blockade to prevent the Iranians from being able to do a blockade. But again, in that sense, they'd just be sitting ducks. Yeah, I think the uranium stockpiles might make sense if they try to go retreat the uranium from the blown up nuclear plant. But even again, I don't see that happening. I can see them like faking it and saying we did it, and them doing it like a fucking desert in Saudi Arabia or something. That actually, that's probably, they might do that. That makes a lot of sense actually now that I think about it. But at the end of the day, speech was a nothing burger. The troop movements, though, that I've seen, like most of the big military bases, Air Force bases that train Black Hawk helicopters, have been doing like 24/7 training for the past like 2 weeks. And the place that does the most, like deployment for Black Hawk helicopter operators, are not. And that's probably because they've already been deployed. Right? So it was a nothing burger. 13 soldiers though. Meanwhile, Iran counting almost 2,000 civilians, and somehow the U.S. is going to frame that as a win somehow. I also seen reports of potentially um, the insider paper said, this is 3 days ago, secret plan to rescue thousands of Brits from Middle East if Trump launches Iran ground invasion now being drawn up. That's pretty interesting. There's been bunch of different people who have reported that. The Daily Mail, Conflict Spot. Yeah. So yeah, that's pretty interesting. All right, let's see what some other news is saying about this.
Oil prices surged again today after President Trump did not provide a clear timeline on the end of the war in Iran or a potential reopening of the Strait of Hormuz during his address last night. International Brent crude prices were up around $108 a barrel this afternoon. National average gas prices remain above $4 after hitting their highest level since 2022 Tuesday, according to AAA. Analysts say energy prices are likely to remain high until shipping resumes in the Strait of Hormuz. U.S. stocks saw a sharp sell-off this morning in response to rising oil prices. The market recovered most of the losses by midday, but the Dow Jones still closed in the red. The Dow is down 61 points, while the Nasdaq is up 38 points. S&P 500 up 7 points. CBS News senior business and tech correspondent Jolene Kent joins us. So is it possible to reduce gas prices while the strait is still closed?
Wouldn't that be nice, Lindsay, if it could be so simple, but it is highly unlikely that that is possible. And all you have to do is look at the numbers. Back last year, about 20 million barrels a day went through the Strait of Hormuz. That has decreased since the war started by as much as a potential 16 million barrels. So effectively, you have the Strait of Hormuz, which is completely shut at this point, virtually shut, we should say. And so that then is going to impact oil prices, and we've seen it bear out over the last 5 weeks, and it continues to go up. Now, the concern here is that there is a lack of a hard, fast timeline on when the strait could reopen, whether or not there are productive talks in that regard. And we are worried, and we're hearing from these worried analysts who say, you know, in a worst case scenario here, if this continues apace, there's concern of an unprecedented price of $200 a barrel. That is very extreme, and that would, again, be unprecedented. But that is what some analysts are looking at if it continues at this pace. Now, we know that back on March 30th, just a couple of days ago, the G7 said that they're going to do anything in their power to prevent a major crisis on this front. But for the people we've been interviewing across the country this week about the state of the economy, I can tell you multiple families in Kansas, in Arizona, and other places are telling me that they are already making sacrifices when they fill up at the pump when it comes to what else they're able to pay for in their monthly budget.
All right, so Trump gives his big speech, or what we thought was going to be a big speech, and essentially a nothing burger. The big primetime address on the Iran war on Wednesday night, April 1st. The whole thing was basically him standing there and saying, "We're almost done." Well, the oil markets immediately called bullshit, jumped 3 to 4% the second that he stopped talking, basically. And that's the tell right there. Markets don't care about rhetoric, they price material reality. And the material reality is thousands of Marines and special operations forces staged across the Middle East, the Strait of Hormuz still closed, and a bombing campaign that's killed over 700 or 1,700 Iranians compared to what is now 13 U.S. American soldiers. 13. That was the headline under the number that Trump dropped. 13 U.S. soldiers dead after a month of war. He framed it like a tragedy, which, but notice what didn't get much airtime here, and that's the asymmetry. Iran's reporting, again, almost 2,000 civilians killed. That's not a war between equals, right? That's a demolition campaign with extremely predictable collateral damage that the U.S. media will never frame as such because American casualties are mourned individually while Iranian deaths get rendered as statistics or ignored entirely. And Trump was explicit about what this war actually is. He said regime change is not the goal, even though he did say that on the night of the invasion on the 28th. And just got to sit with that for a second because the US just spent a month bombing another country, sinking its navy, destroying its missile capabilities, threatening to obliterate its oil infrastructure. And the stated objective is not even to change the government, it's subordination. Permanent strategic degradation is what it is. The goal is to make sure Iran can never deter Israel, can never project regional power, can never defend itself efficiently. And this isn't about liberating anybody. It's about kneecapping a state that refuses to accept its assigned role in the US managed order. And the objectives document that came out from the White House laid it out cleanly: destroy ballistic missiles, annihilate the Navy, sever support for proxy forces, prevent nuclear acquisition, and dismantling the infrastructure of sovereignty. It's ensuring that Iran, even if the government stays exactly the same, becomes strategically irrelevant. A country that can be threatened, that can be bombed, but can't hit back in ways that matter. And Trump justified relaunching strikes by claiming that Iran tried to rebuild its nuclear program after last year's Operation Midnight Hammer, which, fine, maybe that did happen. But it's worth noting that those claims hadn't been independently verified, and Iran completely denies it. But verification doesn't matter when you're already bombing. The accusation becomes the justification retroactively. And that's how these things work. You create the crisis and then explain why you had no choice but to respond.
Tensions between Washington and its NATO allies are growing as Trump increasingly makes it clear he's not happy with the lack of military support for the war in Iran. France, Italy, and Spain have all denied the US use of their airspace or military bases for the war, with Spain closing its airspace entirely and Italy blocking American bombers from landing in Sicily. And Trump is warning the US will remember. On Tuesday, our Pentagon reporter Phil Stewart asked Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth if that was the case.
And is the United States still committed to NATO's collective defense?
And as far as NATO is concerned, that's a decision that will be left to the president. But I'll just say a lot has been laid bare. A lot has been shown to the world about what our allies would be willing to do for the United States of America when we undertake an effort of this scope on behalf of the free world.
Now, the NATO thing, right? Hours before the speech, Trump told Reuters that he was absolutely considering pulling the US out of NATO because European allies wouldn't join the war on Iran or help reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And that threat dominated the news cycle. It sent European defense ministries into complete panic mode, and then nothing. He didn't announce withdrawal in the actual address. He raised some frustrations. He made it clear that Europe's on its own for securing Middle Eastern oil, but stopped short of the formal declaration that anyone and everyone was essentially expecting. And I think that that's the move here: float the threat, let it do the political work, and then withhold the actual decision. And the ambiguousness of this is the leverage. He gets to keep NATO anxious. He gets to keep Europe scrambling, and reserves the option to either follow through or pretend that he was never serious. And meanwhile, he's already shifted the Strait of Hormuz problem onto the Europeans' shoulders. If you want the oil, you have to go secure it. And the US just redefined its role from global guarantor to arms dealer with an attitude. And another thing that it does too is it opens up another potential for markets for him to be able to manipulate, where he's like, oh, maybe I will, maybe I won't, maybe or Europe will, maybe Europe won't. So that like people closer to him in Europe will be able to know and be able to benefit from these things. And the part that should scare normal people, right? CBS reported before the speech that hundreds of special operations forces, plus thousands of Marines and Army paratroopers, are currently positioned in the region. That's not for withdrawal, right? That's not for contingency. That's for possible operations to include reopening the strait by force, striking Carg Island's oil terminal, or, and this one's ambitious, seizing the Iran stockpile for enriched uranium. And as I said earlier, I think that there's a chance that they might fake that they did that, like fake that they went and got the uranium out and not actually have gotten the uranium out, but just like stage it to make it look like they did. And again, that's like one of the only ways, like that would be a like an off ramp where they can just claim, yeah, we took all the uranium, they don't have anything. And you just use like a field in a desert in Kuwait or something. Because you have this posture, right? With that posture, you don't stage that amount of forces for that kind of ground capability if you're going to be just winding down. It's one of those, again, move it or lose it things. And that's the infrastructure of escalation. That's the escalation trap. Trump can say we're finishing the job in 2 to 3 weeks all he wants, but the force posture says the opposite. And the contradiction isn't a sloppy message either. It's intentional. It keeps options open at all times and it lets him claim victory while preserving the ability to go harder if he decides that it's useful. And he promised to hit Iran, quote, extremely hard over the next 2 to 3 weeks and send them, quote, back to the Stone Age where they belong, in the same speech where he said the mission's almost complete. And that's not unintended confusion, right? That's intended flexibility. The public gets a timeline and a victory narrative, and the military gets authorization to keep hammering. And markets see through it immediately, which is why oil spiked the moment he finished talking. And let's talk about those oil prices for a second, because Brent crude had been climbing since this started. The International Energy Agency is warning the global supply system has gone from buffered to fragile. April's projected oil loss is double what March's was. One more disruption, and there's nothing left to absorb the shock. But Trump has blamed Iran for this situation when Trump was the one who started it, right? And not the war he started, not the bombing campaign that the US has initiated. It is Iranian attacks on tankers that he has said is the cause for this, as if the whole thing didn't start because the US decided to destroy, Iran's strategic military capacity. And US gas is over $4 a gallon right now, up 30%. Diesel's above 5. Those costs don't land on the people making the decisions. They land on working people trying to get to work, to heat their homes, to move goods. And the framing is already set because it's Iran's fault for resisting, not it's America's fault for starting the war. And that's how imperial costs get externalized. The war is over there. The bill shows up here, and the explanation never mentions cause, and it only mentions effect. So, what did we learn from the speech? We learned that the war is not ending anytime soon, that regime change was never the goal because subordination is cheaper and far more sustainable, right? And Trump's ready to dangle the NATO withdrawal as leverage while making Europe responsible for its own oil security, which is just hilarious. And that thousands of US troops are staged for operations that haven't been authorized yet, and they could be at any moment, and that the oil markets are pricing in exactly what the speech tried to obscure. And the fact is that this is nowhere near being over, and this empty address is essentially just a placeholder, a way to look decisive while keeping every option on the table. And the markets saw it, Iran saw it, Europe saw it. The only people expected not to see it are the American public, because the American public, they were just told that the mission is almost complete while the infrastructure for escalation quietly keeps expanding in the background, which is not a sustainable place to be.
My fellow Australians, by nature, we're an optimistic country, but I understand that right now it's hard to be positive. The war in the Middle East has caused the biggest spike in petrol and diesel prices in history. Australia is not an active participant in this war, but all Australians are paying higher prices because of it. I know that you're seeing this at the servo and at the supermarket, and I understand farmers and truckies, small businesses and families are doing it tough. And the reality is, the economic shocks caused by this war will be with us for months. Tonight I want to speak directly with you about what the government is doing to shield Australia in these uncertain times, and also what all of us can do to help our country and help each other in the period ahead. On Monday, National Cabinet adopted the National Fuel Security Plan. Leaders from both sides of politics, from right around the country, working together to keep Australia moving, making sure that we are prepared so that if the global situation gets worse and our fuel supplies are seriously disrupted over the long term, we can coordinate the next steps together. Now, it's the Australian way that people want to do their bit. And there are simple ways that you can. You should go about your business and your life as normal. Enjoy your Easter. And if you're hitting the road, don't take more fuel than you need, just fill up like you normally would. Think of others in your community, in the bush and in critical industries. And over coming weeks, if you can switch to catching the train or bus or tram to work, do so. That builds our reserves and it saves fuel for people who have no choice but to drive. Farmers and miners and tradies who need diesel every single day. And all those shift workers and nurses who do so much for our country. The months ahead may not be easy. I want to be upfront about that. No government can promise to eliminate the pressures that this war is causing. I can promise we will do everything we can to protect Australia from the worst of it. These are uncertain times, but I'm absolutely certain of this. We will deal with these global challenges the Australian way, working together and looking after each other, as we always have. Thank you and good evening.
All right, so April Fool's Day 2026 turns into the most synchronized manufacturing of consent performance that we've seen in many, many years. Three allied governments, the US, the UK, and Australia, all deliver national addresses within hours of each other, all talking about Iran, all talking about oil prices, all performing the same basic move, turning a geopolitical crisis into a cost of living conversation. You're just going to accept this as the way things are, the natural law of order, like similar to COVID. But here's what actually is happening. The Strait of Hormuz is getting disrupted. Tankers are being rerouted. Insurance costs are spiking. Safety guarantees are not being obliged. Oil supplies are tightening and financial markets are reacting. And suddenly, your bills, your heating bills, your grocery transport costs, your manufacturing inputs, everything downstream from energy is starting to climb and climb massively. The war out there stops being over there and becomes the one on your gas station sign. And that's the material chain. That's what people care about. Conflict creates disruption, creates shortages, creates price shocks, creates domestic political problems. And governments cannot control that chain directly. They can't magic more oil into existence. They can't force tankers through a blockaded strait. They can control how you understand what's happening to you and manage the perception of that. That's the function of these types of speeches, not to change reality, but to manage the perception of it, to preempt the question, why is this happening to me, before it becomes, who decided this should happen to me? And Trump's version focused on closure, limited objectives. We're achieving our goals. We're stepping back. This won't drag on forever, which makes sense because the war is deeply unpopular and rising fuel costs are making it much worse. And his speech really aimed to reassure people who do not want another endless entanglement, that this one has some type of exit ramp, which it doesn't look like it's going to.
now entered a second month, and while we're working at pace for de-escalation and peace, it is now clear that the impact of this war will affect the future of our country. So today I want to reassure the British people that no matter how fierce this storm, we are well placed to weather it, and that we have a long-term plan to emerge from it a stronger and more secure nation. First, let me say once again, this is not our war. We will not be drawn into the conflict. That is not in our national interest. And the most effective way we can support the cost of living in Britain is to push for de-escalation in the Middle East and a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, which is such a vital route for energy. To that end, we're exploring each and every diplomatic avenue that is available to us, because I do have to level with people on this. This will not be easy. Let me turn now to the impact at home, because I know that this is causing huge concern. People turn on their television, they look at their screens, they say explosions, infrastructure blown up, aggressive rhetoric. They worry that the UK will be dragged into this. We won't. But I also know that people have a deep sense that this will affect their family and their household. They can see it at the petrol pumps, and they worry about their energy bills. It is the job of government to meet these moments, not just with immediate action, but also with clarity about our direction. So on our economy, on our energy, and on our defence, this time will be different. We will make Britain a fairer and more secure country, because that hope is what is needed as the country comes together, and because how we emerge from this crisis will define us for a generation. We're taking back control of our energy security by investing in clean British energy, because that is the only way we get your bills off the roller coaster that is controlled by Putin and the Iranian regime. Now we have made progress on this front, on agriculture, electricity, emissions trading, and more. But as the Chancellor has rightly pointed out, Brexit did deep damage to our economy, and the opportunities to strengthen our security and cut the cost of living are simply too big to ignore. So, in the coming weeks, we will announce a new summit with our EU partners. And I can tell you that at that summit, the UK will not just ratify existing commitments made at last year's summit. We want to be more ambitious. Closer economic cooperation, closer security cooperation, a partnership that recognises our shared values, our shared interests, and our shared future. A partnership for the dangerous world that we must navigate together. A world where this government will be guided at all times by the interests of the British people. Thank you.
Meanwhile, Starmer went in a different direction. He separated military involvement from economic exposure. This is not our war. This becomes the headline, which is brilliant framing because it lets him justify energy subsidies and cost of living support without admitting, that the UK is participating directly militarily. And then in Australia, Albanese just goes straight scarcity management mode, use less fuel, don't hoard, take public transit, take the tram, trust the system to stabilize things because the system is going to come to your aid, hopefully, in a liberal democracy. And then we have very different tones, but the same structure. All three of these, Western leaders translating geopolitical instability into domestic expectations. All three of them are framing economic pain. It's pretty much just unavoidable. All three are positioning the state as the thing standing between the people and chaos. And obviously, this isn't accidental. This coordination is not accidental. It just doesn't come together in some smoky room. It's just structural alignment. These countries share intelligent networks. They depend on the same energy markets. They face identical political pressures when those markets get disrupted. And the parallel messaging happens because underlying conditions are shared, and that's what ultimately is shaping their actions. But for Iran does something genuinely disruptive because hours before Trump's primetime address, the Iranian president, Pezeshkian, releases an open letter to the American people, not to the American government, to the people directly. Pezeshkian asked them to look beyond the machinery of misinformation and consider whether this war actually serves their interests. He asked whether America entered as a proxy for Israel and whether Israel now intends to fight Iran to the last American soldier and the last American taxpayer dollar. And the content of his letter very much matters because it's not just about the timing, right? It's a national address in prime time functions very much as a narrative anchor, and whoever speaks first sets the frame. And this letter from Iran sits right in between introducing doubt before certainty gets its broadcast, and it offers an alternative interpretation before the dominant one gets broadcasted out. And it doesn't need to convince the majority, it just needs to fracture consensus at the exact moment that consensus is being constructed. And that's what's actually being fought over here. Is a shared audience, not diplomats, not generals, regular people trying to why their lives are getting more expensive and whether they should accept it. And the Western framing says it's a necessary crisis. Trump says objectives are nearing completion. Starmer says Britain is well placed to weather the storm. And Albanese admits months of economic shocks, but urges calm. The message is ultimately stability, responsibility, inevitability. And the Iranian framing says it's a constructed conflict. The war isn't inevitable. The threat has been manufactured. The economic pain results from political decisions of Western leaders, not natural forces. And if you're being asked to pay for interests that aren't yours, you should be upset. And that's their message to the American people. And both narratives address the same question. Why is this happening? Who is responsible? What should I accept? Who should I question? And, that competition is very much material. If the Western framing holds, the path forward is controlled de-escalation and managed economic adjustment. If the Iranian framing gains traction, public skepticism rises, political pressure builds, and the legitimacy of continued action erodes. 1 month in, the U.S. political disapproval remains sky high, while Congress has done nothing, which tells you the battle on that information terrain has already been lost. We have new footage coming out where it just gets completely absurd here, where Starmer declares, this is not our war. Well, 23 U.S. long-range bombers are operating out of RAF Fairford, launching bombing missions over Iran from British soil. The gap between the statement and the material reality isn't an accident because it's the operational mechanisms. The state secures domestic consent for conflicts they can't formally acknowledge by simply asserting the opposite of what's happening. And public persuasion isn't supplementary to military capacity anymore. It's constitutive of it. That's why Iran's counter letter isn't just symbolic, it's strategic intervention. The dependency Western governments have on continuous consent, they're exploiting that. And by addressing the American public directly, the Iranian leadership is able to separate public interest from state interest at the exact moment that the state is trying to fuse them together. And the military dimension continues in the Gulf because it's just not as visible of a struggle. It's informational. And who defines the war? Who assigns responsibility? Who determines whether costs are acceptable? Those questions are secondary, but they're not secondary to to the people who are asking how is this worth? You know what I mean? They're secondary to the people who are doing it. They're secondary to the people who are communicating these things. But they shape what happens next just as much as the strike packages and the sanctions and the assassinations lists, etc. Because narrative dominance is now the prerequisite for this war. 3 aligned governments spoke to stabilize domestic perception. 1 government spoke to destabilize the dominant narrative, and the outcome of that exchange is going to determine how the next phase unfolds, because in conflicts like this, control over events matters, and control over how those events are understood matters just as much. And this is manufacturing consent when capital supply chains face disruptions that they caused themselves, not crude propaganda, sophisticated crisis communication that translates distant military action into domestic economic terms, that coordinates messaging across allies without requiring scripts, and it anticipates counter narratives and moves to preempt them. The Strait of Hormuz functions not as geography, but as a narrative device in this instance, the choke point through which imperial intervention becomes comprehensible to the public who's going to pay for it. And when that choke point is threatened, the state doesn't debate. It deploys the infrastructure of perception management to make intervention appear necessary, limited, and ultimately unavoidable. And that is the infrastructure that activated today on April 1st. And it'll activate again many more times, because the dependency it serves is structural, not situational. And the war will continue. And so does the war over how you're allowed to understand the terms of it.
Yeah, that's right. And Vani, also, let's just remind everybody that this letter was addressed to the American public by the Iranian president, but this was before Trump's national address overnight. And I should say it's the early hours of the morning over here in the region. Still no official or unofficial response yet from Iran. But what the Iranian state TV did put out before the speech was a suggestion that Iran had never asked for a ceasefire. So that's kind of the starting point of where we're at. Now, yesterday, the Iranian president, Mr. Pezeshkian, did release this open letter to the American public, full of a lot of rhetoric. He was really questioning whether Washington is putting America first or acting as a proxy for Israel, is what he has described in that letter. He talks about rising oil prices. He says that Iran are acting in self-defense. I think President Trump has made it clear the last couple of days that he wants to de-link the fate of the strait, so to speak, with military operations and leave it to other countries to sort out, especially those countries that are more reliant on the oil that passes through the strait. China, a key one. He's explicitly referenced China. Now, when it comes to some of those efforts, the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer did refer to a meeting that's going to take place today that will be chaired by Yvette Cooper, and there will be, it's expected around 35 countries are going to participate in this virtual meeting to discuss potential economic, diplomatic, and possibly even military measures to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The preferred channel obviously being diplomatic at this point, these countries getting together to assess whether Iran will come to the negotiating table. If that fails, then perhaps go down the economic route, apply more sanctions. If that fails, then as a very last option, military. But many countries and European nations have expressed their reservation about getting involved militarily.
So yeah, Iran's president did something that doesn't happen very often during a war. He wrote directly to the American public, not through the State Department, not through some diplomatic back channel or news media, just straight over the heads of everyone whose job depends on essentially managing the narrative about why we need to keep Iran surrounded, sanctioned, and a bad day away from getting boots on the ground invaded. And obviously, the form matters here. When the head of the state has to root around your government to talk to you, that's obviously not diplomacy breaking down. That's someone pointing out that the conflict isn't actually between regular people in two countries. It's between regular people and the machinery that claims to represent them while doing something completely different. Because here's obviously the thing about Iran and the U.S. hostility it requires constant maintenance on the US side. It doesn't just exist on its own. American workers have no material beef with the Iranian people. Your life doesn't get any better because Iran's economy is being crippled. You don't wake up safer because there's a carrier group parked in the Persian Gulf. The antagonism has to be actively produced year after year through threat inflation and sanctions that fail their stated goals but somehow never get reversed. And Pezeshkian's letter works by making that gap visible. He doesn't need to convince you Iran is virtuous or that the Islamic Republic is some model society. He just needs to show you that the story you're being told why this conflict exists serves somebody else's interest entirely. And once you see that gap between what you're told and what actually benefits you, the whole structure starts looking different. And that gap, again, starts in 1953. And the CIA orchestrated a coup against Iran's democratically elected government because their prime minister, Mossadegh, nationalized the oil industry, not threatened to or considered. He actually did it. And the people of Iran said, these are our resources. We're going to control them. And the response wasn't negotiation, it was regime change. And that's not the beginning of a long history of diplomatic disagreement, right? That's the creation of a permanent structural hostility because that coup taught every Iranian who came after them that was the way in which political development took place, democratic or otherwise. And that no matter what you did, no matter what political struggle you took up, it would be interrupted whenever it conflicted with the Western resource extraction machine. And the lesson there wasn't play nice and you'll be treated fairly. The lesson is your sovereignty is negotiable based on our interest. And every conversation about Iran that starts in 1979 with the revolution or the hostage crisis is deliberately erasing this foundation. Iran's irrational refusal to trust Western diplomatic promises didn't come from in a vacuum. It didn't come out of nowhere. It came from watching what happened when they trusted the democratic process and got overthrown for it. And the pattern continues, right? When Iraq invaded Iran in 1980, the United States backed Saddam Hussein, not quietly, but actively. And with intelligence sharing, weapons, diplomatic cover, Iraq fought an 8-year war that killed somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million Iranians, and the U.S. helped. Why? Because Iran's revolutionary government had overthrown the Shah and nationalized its assets. And the punishment for refusing client state status was an entire war of aggression fought with American support. Iraq used chemical weapons extensively against Iranian troops and civilians, and the United States provided the battlefield intelligence that helped those attacks work while blocking intentional condemnation at the UN. And this isn't ancient history either. It's not ancient history that has nothing to do with the current policy. Iran's entire military posture develops directly from this experience. The country fought a defensive war for 8 years, got gassed, received zero international protection, and survived through internal mobilization to this day. And then American analysis look at Iran's missile programs and regional proxy relationships and call it aggressive expansion or aggressive posture. And Iran didn't expand into the region. Iran built the capacity to prevent a repeat of the 1980s. And the difference there is everything. And this is where the threat narrative does its most important work. It inverts reality. American military forces operate from bases in Iraq, in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in Qatar, in the United Arab Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, in Turkey. The U.S. Navy patrols in the Persian Gulf continuously. American aircraft fly surveillance along Iranian borders day in, day out. And this forward development surrounding a country that hasn't invaded another state since 1979. And but the whole framing again is that Iran developing missiles that can reach those bases is somehow aggressive. Iran supporting Hezbollah or Iraqi militias becomes destabilizing. The inversion
requires pretending geography doesn't exist. You know, Iranian missiles can only reach American forces because American forces position themselves on Iran's borders. That's not a threat assessment, that's describing a map in existing material reality. Same logic appears for the nuclear program. US intelligence hasn't concluded that Iran has built a bomb, but the research program alone justifies sanctions and military threats. Meanwhile, Israel's actual nuclear arsenal draws no response. And the selectivity isn't a flaw in the analysis, it's the point. The issue isn't nuclear proliferation. The issue isn't even a state that has a secret nuclear program, because if it was, Israel wouldn't have one. The issue is which state gets to have military capabilities that complicate American freedom of action. And then there's the sanctions. Comprehensive sanctions started in the 1990s, intensified through the turn of the century, into the 2000s, into the aughts, into the 2020s, into the pandemic era, and now into the second Trump era. The stated goal is forcing policy change, either regime collapse or fundamental shifts on the nuclear program or their regional activity, governance structure. 4 decades later, Iran's government is stable, their nuclear program continues, and their regional influence has only expanded. And by any measure connected to the stated objectives, the sanctions and the pressure that has been put on them has failed completely. Iran's literacy rate has gone up around 50% since the revolution to over 85% now. University enrollment exploded. The country developed domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing, aerospace capabilities, highly advanced manufacturing production, all under sanctions designed to cripple exactly that kind of development. And this policy's continuation after obvious failures proves the state's objectives were never the real ones. Sanctions serve other functions. They maintain pressure that justifies military presence. They create economic hardship that gets blamed on the Iranian government, and they sustain the political coalition that benefits from permanent tension. And this is the post 9/11 diagnosis and the pattern that is applied to Iran. The policy persists not because it works, but because dismantling it would require abandoning the institutional interest that it actually serves. And the third party, obviously, in all of this comes in when the United States gives Israel over $3 billion a year in direct military aid, plus additional funding for missile defense, weapons stockpile, intelligence sharing. And this continues regardless of which party is in power, regardless of Israeli actions that contradict stated American policy. Iran represents Israel's primary regional counterweight, the only state with sufficient military capability, economic resources, and the political will to constrain Israel's freedom of action and impunity. And American hostility towards Iran serves Israel's strategic objectives by maintaining pressure on that counterweight. Whether it serves American workers in a different question, obviously, with a pretty clear answer that anybody who's watching this knows, because, well, Americans, in the sense of the structural sense of how people in America and people who live in the imperial core benefit from the hegemony that is established through these types of imperial adventures, it just increases your energy costs. Permanent Middle East deployments don't make you safer. They create the conditions that generate American anti-Americanism globally. You're bearing the cost of someone else's regional strategy while being told it's about your security. And Ian's appeal works by making this triangular structural visible to you. He's not arguing, Iranian and American interests align perfectly, because obviously they don't. He's showing you that the current policy serves a third party while imposing cost on both populations and the gaps between them. And that's the direct appeal that to the American people reveals here. And every escalation makes reversing course harder and harder and harder. And when the US designates Iran's a revolutionary guard. As a terrorist organization, it creates legal structures that criminalize normal engagement. And when sanctions expand to secondary targets, they force global compliance regardless of other countries' interests. And when military infrastructure gets built for Iran contingencies, it generates bureaucratic momentum towards using it. And that's what we're seeing now. Military planners who have spent their career preparing Iran operations don't easily accept that it was all for naught. It was all wasted effort. Defense contractors who built Iran-specific capabilities don't surrender those revenue streams. Political careers built on Iran hawkishness doesn't suddenly reverse. The longer that it goes, the more structurally resistant to change it becomes. And the real audience for this letter isn't policymakers. It's not even you specifically. The audience is the gap between those things, the visible space between what you're told justifies Iran's policy and what the policy actually accomplishes for you in this moment materially. And the historical reference to 1953 and the Iran-Iraq War established the current policy that has roots that you didn't vote for. And development data, despite sanctions, shows stated objectives have obviously failed. And the direct appeal to the American people itself proves normal diplomatic channels don't include your input. That time is over. And making that gap visible doesn't require you to think Iran is virtuous or that the Islamic Republic is somehow admirable to an average American. It requires recognizing that someone is lying about who benefits from the permanent conflict that we're walking into. And once you see that gap, the question becomes very clear, right? Not is Iran dangerous, but who needs me to believe Iran is dangerous and why? And that question, that's the one that the entire apparatus exists to prevent you from asking. And this letter that routes around the State Department to land directly at your feet is designed to make you ask those questions.
A major deployment out of Fort Bragg as the conflict in Iran intensifies. The Pentagon says elements of the 82nd Airborne, including a brigade combat team, are heading to the U.S. Central Command in the region.
It comes as more than a dozen U.S. troops have already been killed in the fight.
The Pentagon confirming elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, including headquarters support units and the 1st Brigade Combat Team, are now deploying to the CENTCOM region as the war in Iran stretches into its 4th week. CBS News reporting the mission could include both ground forces and command elements, but many details remain classified. Back here at home, the wait is filled with uncertainty. Now, the Pentagon is not saying how long these troops will be deployed and what exactly they will be doing once they're on the ground in the Middle East.
So Trump gets up there and basically announces victory on April 1st, so a month. So it's about the top of the cycle of Beltane rather than the end of it. April 1st rather than May 1st when Bush did it. All you pagans or astute occultists know what I'm talking about. But anyways, Trump gets out there, announces victory, claims that Iran is decimated, that the war is basically finished. We don't need their oil anymore. Clean ending. Mission accomplished, essentially. Time to wrap this up and move on. Classic stuff from the American perspective. We've all seen this story before because you've literally heard this exact story before multiple times across multiple wars, and it never actually means what it claims to mean. And here's what's actually happening. Because while he's saying this, the Pentagon is accelerating Marine deployments to the Gulf, not slowing them down, not preparing withdrawal logistics, accelerating the 31st and the 11th Marine Expeditionary Units, the USS Boxer, with 2,200 Marines on board, leaving California weeks ahead of schedule. Elements from the 82nd Airborne Immediate Response Force getting orders to pack up and head east. This is not what winding down looks like. This is what the next phase of this war looks like. The gap between what's being said and what's being done isn't confusion. It's a part of the strategy. You announce the end early so that everything comes after gets interpreted as cleanup instead of escalation. You frame it as mopping up so the public doesn't register that you're actually expanding and escalating and accelerating this war. And so this war is not over. The war is being restructured under the rhetorical cover of resolution. This is Imperial War Management 101. Perform victory through speech while the material operations deepen. And the energy independence angle in this is very interesting. And that's where it gets complex because that part is technically true. The U.S. is not a net exporter for oil right now. Domestic production has fundamentally shifted the energy equation. The U.S. is not dependent on Gulf crude the way that they were in the 70s or early 2000s, and that's obviously true. But the political use being made of that fact is something completely different. Oil markets are global. Disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, it doesn't just affect countries that import from there directly, it moves through shipping insurance, futures contracts, refinery calculations, all of it. And prices spike everywhere because the market is integrated. So when Trump says we don't need Middle Eastern oil anymore, he's not describing insulation from the region's dynamics. He's describing a shift from being a consumer dependent on Gulf supply to being a producer who benefits when the Gulf supply gets disrupted. Think about what that means strategically. If conflict or sanctions make Gulf oil unreliable, American producers win. If the strait closes or narrows, prices jump. Domestic production becomes more profitable, and countries that are buying from the Gulf start looking at the U.S. suppliers instead. And energy dependence isn't creating distance from the Middle East instability, it's weaponizing that instability as a market advantage. And that's what he's doing. The U.S. doesn't need to import the oil to care deeply about controlling who does and under what conditions. And what takes you directly to the Hormuz Strait, which is the clearest expression of what's changing here. Trump says countries that depend on the strait should protect it themselves, take responsibility for securing the choke point, or just buy from the United States instead. And for decades, that deal was implicit. America guarantees the sea lanes, keep the choke points open, provide security for global energy flows as a sort of public good. And in exchange, you get to shape the rules of the system. And that protection, it wasn't transactional. It was the overhead cost of maintaining that hegemony. You secure the commons, you get influence over the commons and how they operate. And the model is just getting scrapped. That's what's happening here. Security provision is becoming conditional, and he's essentially ratcheting up the tensions, and then also like taking, because they have a benefit in the oil market, he's just taking everybody else hostage, right? The message is essentially, if you want to keep the strait open, you pay for it, or you accept whatever political demands come with continued protection, or you shift your energy purchases towards American suppliers and the profit structures that they represent and the power structures that they represent. The third redirects global energy flows through American production. And either way, the choke point doesn't become less important. It becomes a toll gate. And that isn't American protectionism. That isn't American isolationism. This is empire learning, how to charge a rent by proxy, right? The US still controls the infrastructure, still has the capacity to close or open the strait, so they claim. But now the cost of maintaining that control gets pushed onto the countries whose economy, social, economic dependence is on what flows through that choke point in the Persian Gulf. You're not withdrawing from the region, you're converting guaranteed protection into a fee for service arrangement. And the military deployments make it impossible to pretend otherwise. If the war were genuinely winding down, you'd see force reduction, you'd see base closures, you'd see logistical contraction. Instead, you're seeing the opposite. You're seeing MEUs getting rushed forward. You're seeing airborne units heading to theater, operational planning for scenarios that require far more capacity, not less, and potential operations to seize Karg Island, reopen the Strait by force, a naval blockade, secure Iranian nuclear facilities if things escalate further, which I think they might. My theory, my pocket theory here is that they might fake that and just like set up something in the Kuwaiti desert and make it look like they're retrieving the uranium from like a spot and just like put that out and say like we went to an isolated area and we found it, and just be a complete scam. I could see that being like their one of their off ramps here. The timeline and the rhetoric don't match each other. That's the biggest thing here. Trump says 2 to 3 weeks until operations wind down. The Pentagon is developing contingencies for ground operations that will require months of sustainment. And the gap in that communication between those two things is pretty much the point here. It's as part of the strategy. One layer is public messaging, where wars get compressed into clean narratives with beginning and endings. The other layer is operational reality, where commitments deepen and mission parameters expand. The space between those layers is where escalation happens without political accountability. Meanwhile, at home, you get this split screen. On one side, the U.S. is at peak economic performance, record investment, high market valuations, maximum productive capacity, able to project strength anywhere without constraint. And on the other side, the exact same administration says basic social infrastructure is unaffordable. We can't afford childcare. Can't do it. Healthcare expansion, can't do it. Support systems for working families, we're at war. Fiscal discipline is required to win wars. And that contradiction is the system working as designed. Military projection gets funded without debate because that's treated as this essential state function for your own national security. Social reproduction, the systems that actually sustain the population, that gets framed as discretionary spending subject to austerity. And the state has unlimited capacity to deploy the Marines to the Persian Gulf. It has no capacity to provide universal health care, universal child care. And that's not hypocrisy. That's a hierarchy of priorities embedded in how imperial political economy operates from the very beginning of America. You know what I mean? That's the treats. That's why social democracy used to be such a everyone used to love social democracy, but then the treats ran out. And so now we're living in the inverse of that. It's just another type of social fascism in a way. It's just reactionary. I don't even know because it's like you're saying, it's like you're claiming that it's that like social democracy is happening, or at least I don't even know, social liberalism or social development, social developmentalism, social economic expansion. You're using that language, but it's just retracting further and further and further. But that's that's how imperial political economy works, especially in these moments. Capital accumulation and the geopolitical dominance are mandatory. Everything else is negotiable. So pull it together. Energy independence gets weaponized to shift from consumer dependency to supplier leverage, and victory gets announced early to create political cover for what is continued operations, and escalation gets masked as cleanup through rhetorical framing that operational reality contracts. And security guarantees get converted into conditional transactions, and domestic strength narratives coexist with austerity requirements that are used to justify projection while constraining provision. And none of this is withdrawal. All of this is restructuring. The U.S. isn't leaving the Middle East, it's redefining how power gets exercised there. It's less as a guarantor, absorbing the costs in exchange for influence, and more as a gatekeeper, extracting payment for access to security infrastructure that it controls. It's less as a stabilizer, maintaining order as a public good, and more as a force shaping instability to generate leverage over its allies and its rivals. It's literally just, it's like a mobster protection racket. That's what it is. And the language of closure is politically necessary because permanent war has limited public tolerance. So interventions get framed as temporary even when infrastructure being built is permanent. Victory gets declared even when objectives remain unmet because the declaration establishes the frame within which everything after that gets interpreted differently. And the war hasn't ended. The war is being repackaged as something that can't end while systems producing it get reorganized to extract more efficiently. Iran hasn't been neutralized to the degree that the rhetoric suggests, not at all. But that was never the actual goal here. The goal is maintaining dominance, and dominance doesn't require resolution. It requires the capacity to shape outcomes, control access, and extract value from the structures of dependency that American power creates and sustains. And this new model is hegemony operating less through provision and more through selective denial. Empire isn't ending. Empire is learning to bill for services it used to provide for influence and calling that transition a withdrawal. That's the move here. Watch the Marines deploy while the speeches talk about coming home. Watch the energy independence become more of market weaponization. Security guarantees will become fee structures, literally a protection racket. And the war and these conflicts will continue on until the fronts finally combine. The front in Africa, the front in the Middle East, and the front in Eastern Europe will all combine. And these wars will continue, and the framing will just keep adapting, and the gap between them is where the next phase happens because like someone once said, America will bleed itself dry by its own imperial overreach, and we're living in that right now. That's where we're at. So where does that leave us? I'm going to do like a full chronicle of this war in my next stream or rant episode thing soon. But apart from that, it leaves us in a place where the war isn't ending anytime soon. It's just being restructured narrative wise, where the victory speech provides cover for deepening operations, where energy independence becomes a euphemism for market weaponization, where austerity disciplines domestic spending while military expenditure remains unlimited, where Iran writes directly to Americans because the gap between state interests and popular interests has become wide enough that exploiting it is worth the attempt. And I'm not saying this ends well. I'm not saying that America's strategy is working. I'm not saying these statements that are being put out by Iranian leadership fractures consensus or changes policy or does anything except get filed away as enemy propaganda by most of the people who hear about it, though I would say more and more people are probably listening to it. But I am saying the fact that they tried tells you something. It tells you that the consent isn't automatic anymore and that the narrative management is necessary because the material reality doesn't speak for itself. And that's the reason why Trump has to give a victory speech like this while deploying amphibious assault units. It's because if you just did the deployment without the speech, the contradiction would just be too obvious. And Trump knows how to embody contradiction, if anything. That's his skill. And every time that gap becomes visible, every time someone asks, wait, who is this actually for? The cost of maintaining this structure goes up a little bit more. But Trump is always able to just say, they love me. It doesn't matter. And the objection to it is never enough to stop it. It's never enough to make it. I mean, it is unsustainable, but it's not unsustainable because of anything internal. And and that's the internal stuff does matter, because it will get to a tipping point where the external forces will make it so that the internal contradictions will matter more and more, enough that the machinery has to work a little harder and harder and harder, and has to coordinate the messaging a little tighter as time goes on, and has to make sure that their allies are all saying the same thing on the same day so the story holds together. And maybe that doesn't sound like much. Maybe it sounds like I'm grasping for hope in a situation that's fundamentally very bleak. And it is bleak. The war is not ending. The structure isn't collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions, although it's getting there. Hegemony, American hegemony is resilient, especially in this region, and it's resilient precisely because it doesn't require resolution. It requires the capacity to shape outcomes, control access, and extract value from the arrangements that it produces and the chaos that it produces in this instance. But resilience isn't the same as inevitability like it once was. And visibility isn't the same as powerlessness. And the letter to the people, it doesn't stop this war, but it does make the war cost a little bit more to sustain. And in a system that depends on imposing costs on others while minimizing cost to yourself, any decrease in maintenance cost is a vulnerability, as many of Iran's neighbors have learned. And that's to take advantage of those vulnerabilities, to exploit those vulnerabilities is not does not mean victory. It's not even a strategy for victory in the long term, because you go up the escalation ladder. I mean, it is for if you're Iran. It isn't if you're in the United States. It becomes the people's war. You start fighting the war on their terrain, and that's where this is headed. It's a friction point, a friction, because the friction accumulates, and at some point the machinery that looked invincible starts to look more and more expensive. It's similar to any American imperial war, right? And expansive things like what's needed to do this, what's needed for victory, gets questioned more and more. And questions in a system that depend on manufacturer consent are the thing that the system is designed to prevent. And America's wars are a lot easier to stop than are wars that our allies are fighting, like in Ukraine or wherever else. Yeah, no, the war isn't ending, but the story that makes the war possible is getting harder to tell, and maybe eventually that's going to matter. Yeah, that's it. I'm Alex Station. Thanks for watching. Talk to you later.